Good morning, everyone. I am Miss Long, and I've been working with you over the past few weeks on ninth grade English Language Arts. And so we're just going to keep the ball rolling, and we're going to go through the rest of the standards over the next 2 weeks that we'll be covering in ninth grade English Language Arts, so that by the time you get to 10th grade English next year, you'll be good to go. Okay? So last week, we were looking at this standard. Okay? Delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, assessing whether the reasoning is valid and the evidence is relevant and sufficient, and identify false statements or fallacious reasoning. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going just to dig a little bit deeper into a text that is very effective. And in fact, we'll talk about that when we get to it. But before we get there, I'd like to do just a brief review of what we went over last week and what you should be looking for as you're doing this standard this week. Okay, so a quick reminder that there are at least 3 purposes of an argument. The obvious one is the first one, to change the reader's mind. Okay, if we have a topic that we feel very strongly about, then we want others to feel that way too, right? Especially if we think that something is wrong or that something should be done a certain way. We're like, well, this is the right thing. This is the right choice. And we want to make other readers feel the way we do. That's the major reason for argument. We talked about last week that argument is not just fussing back and forth, right? It's more than that. It's an academic approach to make people feel the way you do. But now we know that there are some topics that people are never going to agree on. If there was a good solution, that solution would be there. So sometimes those ideas are, those topics are, and we call those controversial topics, people just aren't always going to agree on them, and they're not going to come to the same solution. So in this case, the purpose of an argument is not necessarily to change the reader's mind, but is to convince the reader to accept what is written. Just listen to me. Hear what I have to say. See my side of it. Okay? That's the purpose of argument. And then the last purpose of argument is to motivate the reader to take action based on what is written. Sometimes there are topics that we know that no one really says, oh yeah, I'm pro-bullying, but we know bullying happens, right? So sometimes our purpose in arguing is not so much to say, well, this is wrong, because most people would agree, or at least the ones who would disagree would not verbalize it. So sometimes our job is to motivate that reader to say, here's the problem, now let's fix it, right? Or at least to say, hey, here's some things that we should be taking note of. Now let's do something about it. Okay, so that's the third purpose of argument. Just a reminder, and if you are taking notes, you may want to jot these down if you didn't get these last week. There are at least 5 parts of an argument that are very important. Okay? The first and obvious one is the claim. Claim is how the writer feels, okay? So if you're reading a text, it's what that writer is feeling about the topic. If you're writing it, that is your opinion, okay? That's the claim. Now, grounds are why you feel that way. You have a reason for feeling the way you do, right? And those are your grounds. You're basing your claim on something. Now, in order for us to argue and for people to listen to us and to make change, we have to justify it. And justification is basically using evidence to back yourself up, using source information, facts, statistics, stories even, personal examples that say, well, this is the reason I feel the way I do, and let me prove it to you by showing you what happened, okay? Counterclaim is the opposite side. And guys, I said last week, in order for a text to be argumentative, the text has to address some barrier to what they're stating, okay? And by barrier, I mean, think of it as like a wall. Okay, that's what a barrier is. And sometimes in a topic, we know that people aren't always going to agree with what we're saying. Why? What is it that makes that opposition, that opposite side, feel the way that they do? Okay, that's your counterclaim. And in order to make it an argument, you have to have this last one, rebuttal, showing the weakness in what that counterclaim is. Okay, whatever it is that opposite side says, and it's always important to remind your audience that, I hear what you're saying, but, that's where I teach my students to remember that but in rebuttal. The rebuttal is that, but here's why that's not necessarily true. Or maybe this is the weakness in what you're saying. So if you do not have rebuttal, you're not making a strong argument. Okay, then you're just trying to persuade your readers to hear you. But is that really doing its job if you don't address how the opposite side feels? No. Okay, so today we're going to look at how do writers make their arguments effective. Now, this is new material, and some of you have probably seen some of these terms before. Some of these you should know from this semester. But if you don't, take a minute and jot these down. I'm going to give you just a minute to jot them down, and I'm going to go over them with you and make sure that you understand what each of these means. So remember that argument is the purpose is to convince our readers. So how do we do that? Good writers don't just start blasting their opponent with why the opponent is wrong. How many of us are going to listen to that? If you're disagreeing with your sibling about something, are you going to listen to what they have to say if they keep telling you how wrong you are? No. Right? All it's going to do is just cause a bigger fight. And then your parents are going to step in. So good writers know how to appeal to their audience. And they do this through what we call rhetorical devices. That's just a fancy word for saying making it pretty. That's basically what rhetoric is. Rhetorical devices make language come to life. They make it beautiful. And that's what makes us want to listen to what they're saying. And the text that we're going to look at today does that really well. Okay, so a few rhetorical devices. The first type is appeals, and you may have gone over this in your class before. Appeals are examples or stories or anecdotes that appeal to the reader's emotions, their logic, or just plain common sense. And you see this every single day. If you watch TV, you see this in commercials every single day. If you've seen the ASPCA commercials, or for me, what really hits home are the St. Jude's commercials, where they show those poor, sweet children who are suffering from cancer. And that gets you right here. That makes you feel. So what does it make you want to do? It makes you want to, okay, I'll send my 20 cents a day, right? You want to do that. That's how they appeal to your emotions, right? Same thing with your logic and your ethics. That was the other one. Ethics makes you feel, oh, well, that's not right. We should do something about that. Or appealing to your common sense. Oh, well, if I'm going to save 15% or more by switching to Geico, I should switch to Geico, right? And they use those logical approaches every single time they make a commercial. So those are ways that writers appeal to our feelings, our thoughts, the way we agree with something or disagree. The next one is a little more common. I think students see it more often, and it's easy to find because it's a question. Okay, rhetorical question is a question that makes the reader think. And usually it's a direct address to the reader. Speakers will say, why is this happening? Or, they'll say something. They'll ask them a question. Now, the reader is not expected to necessarily, or the listener is not expected to necessarily answer that question. But what they do is they start thinking about it. And they say, oh, well, that's a good point. Okay? The next is figurative language. You should know what figurative language is. Lots of different types. You have metaphor, simile, hyperbole, personification, all types of figurative language, imagery. Is something that makes that language come to life, and it produces that really powerful image in our heads. And the purpose of this, and we're going to see a lot of this in the speech that we're going to look at, the purpose of using figurative language is to make readers see that this situation looks like this, okay? The next one is, and you may be unfamiliar with this one, antithesis. Antithesis is basically opposite but equal ideas. Think of it as a seesaw. On one hand, you'll have a positive, usually. On the other hand, you'll have a negative. And you've heard these before. In fact, if you've ever heard that famous expression, give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry said that. And he says, either give me a good thing, liberty, or give me death, a bad thing. Okay, and usually it's a good and a bad. You may also have heard this one from JFK, President John F. Kennedy. He said, ask not what your country can do for you, but rather ask what you can do for your country. Okay, so opposite but equal ideas. Okay, antithesis. Next one is illusion. Not illusion with an I, not something foggy that we see, but allusion, which is alluding to, a reference to well-known people, events, or places. Okay, and we're going to see one of those in just a minute. The last one is repetition. Repeating words or phrases for emphasis, for effect. Okay, and we'll see that as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a text. This comes from I Have a Dream by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I do want to let you know that there is some older language in here that we do not use anymore. The term Negro is used in this speech. We do not use that term anymore, but it was acceptable when he was writing and speaking. Okay, so be aware. This is a very beautifully written speech, and it's very powerful. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was speaking in a time when, during the Civil Rights Movement, his speech was so powerful, he literally led millions in the Civil Rights Movement. So what is it that makes his speech so powerful? What is it that makes what he is saying so powerful that he could lead millions of people? So that's what we're going to look at. And guys, that's why argument is so powerful. If we can learn to write, we can learn to change. Okay? And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. does an amazing job with this. So we're going to take just the first couple of paragraphs of his speech, and we're going to see how does he use rhetoric, those rhetorical devices, to appeal to his readers and his listeners. Okay? 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. All right, very first line. Very interesting what he's doing here. He first gave this address on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So he is literally standing right here with that Lincoln Memorial behind him. And he begins with this 50 years ago. Kind of sounds familiar, right? When Abraham Lincoln himself used very similar phrasing in the Gettysburg Address. So that was brilliant in itself. But who is he alluding to here? In whose symbolic shadow we stand today? Abraham Lincoln. And why is it so important that he's using this allusion to President Lincoln? Because what is it that he's talking about? He's reminding his audience that, okay, over 100 years ago, the African Americans were freed from slavery. But he's going to start making the point that, yeah, that may be true, but here's a problem with what I'm seeing today in my time. That's what he's doing. So very brilliantly placed, standing there in front of the Lincoln Memorial and making this allusion to Abraham Lincoln. Okay, Look at the next thing that he does. I want you to look at number 2, this question: what type of figurative language is it when he says, this momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope? He's comparing a beacon light to hope. Kind of almost see a lighthouse, right? What is it that we do when we make a comparison? When we call something, we make that comparison between two things without actually using like or as. We call that a metaphor, right? So he uses this metaphor here. And remember, he's inspiring people. So he wants to use that beautiful image of light, drawing people to him, to get that hope. Look at this one, number 3. What type of figurative language is it when it's calling injustice withering, the withering flames, the flames of withering injustice? Reminding his audience, this is something that even though, slavery may be ended, but what's not? That injustice, those flames of withering injustice. And look at that beautiful image, that heat that comes with it, the hurt, the pain that comes with flames. Very beautifully written, okay? So there's at least one more in this. I want you to see if you can find it. What's another example of figurative language in this paragraph? I'll give you a hint. It's in the last sentence. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. Again, long night, we know that that's not a long night, that's 100 years, right? Or several hundred years, that's what he's talking about there. That's not one long night, but he's comparing it to that darkness, that lack of hope, that lack of light. Very beautifully written. And think about how are they effective? The effect of these rhetorical devices is very strong. Again, enough to literally make change. We're going to look at the next paragraph as well. Okay, and I want you to be considering these questions as I'm reading. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. Wow, very powerful. Look at that repetition. Why does he keep reminding us 100 years later, 100 years later? It takes a long time to make change, right? He is emphasizing here it is 100 years. We should have seen change in these 100 years, but we haven't. And he continually reminds his audience of that 100 years later. Very well put. And speakers do this too, because that repetition is easy to hear, and we're like, oh, well, what he's saying must be important, right? It makes us shut up and listen, right? So we hear that repetition and we say, oh, okay, important. What is the effect of this antithesis? And I went ahead and showed you the antithesis here. It's in green. A lonely island of poverty in a vast ocean of material prosperity. So on one hand, we have this lonely island of poverty, but it's juxtaposed, or it's shown that opposite but equal idea of material prosperity, poverty, prosperity. So he's showing here, and two, he uses that idea of the island in the midst of this huge ocean of prosperity, that his audience is stuck there in the middle of this island of poverty while they're surrounded by this huge ocean of prosperity. Very effective, right? And that comes alive in our minds, especially if we can picture that tiny little island secluded by all of that water. All right, so I want you to think about what are maybe some appeals that Dr. King is making in this paragraph. How does he appeal to our belief in what is right and wrong? That's really powerful. If a speaker can do that, if a speaker can make his audience say, this is really wrong, then he's done a really fantastic job, right? And that's how people make change. That's how people get people to follow them, is to show them, guys, this is a problem. And he does that pretty well. I want you to think about, where does he do that? Okay, how does he do that? How does he maybe appeal to our emotions? How does he make us feel? Look at that second line there. The Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Manacles are those kind of like handcuffs, so they come with chains that are thicker and they hold you captive. That's a pretty powerful image, right? So I want you to think about, how is he appealing to us and how does he make us feel? He does a really good job, right? Very powerful speech. Okay, we're going to be closing right now, so I want you to think about this as you're going through your lesson this week. I want you to look for the following in your text. What is the author's claim? What is it that he's getting at? Think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's making this very bold statement that, yeah, things aren't as bad as they could be, but they still could be so much better, right? And he really made change with that. What evidence does the author use to justify his claim? What evidence does he use to back it up, to show that, okay, this is why it's a problem? And if we were to finish the I Have a Dream speech, then we would see that. We would see what he uses as examples to back himself up. How effective is this claim? And when you're looking at that, if you're trying to analyze the effect of language, then you would ask yourself these questions. In what ways does the author appeal to his audience's emotions, his common sense, his belief in what is right and wrong? What words and phrases are repeated for emphasis? Where do we see some repetition? What figurative language is being used? And you should know those: metaphor, simile, hyperbole, imagery, allusion, anything like that brings those pictures to life. Think about the comparisons that he's using, and then what points are juxtaposed. That's just a big word to show it that we have some antithesis, opposite but equal ideas. What are those? What is that negative that he's comparing to that positive in one statement? What is it that's being done there? Okay, so that's how we determine what is a very effective speech, and that's what you should be looking for as you're going through your text this week. Argument is very beautiful. It can be very beautiful. Speech can be very beautiful. Look for that and look at, how is this author really being effective? Okay. All right, guys. Well, that's all we have time for today. I hope you have a wonderful week. Stay safe and enjoy your reading.